Before we enter the main topic, I need to clarify something many people often misunderstand. Carl Jung never used the term super empath in any of his works. But the importance isn't in the label. The importance is in the essence. The modern concept of the super empath is built on the very foundations Jung described in great depth about the structure of the human psyche. People whose intuition surpasses the conscious mind. People whose sacred wounds allow them to understand the pain of others. People who can see through another's darkness because they have already faced the darkness within themselves. The terminology may be new, but the kind of person it describes Jung recognized long ago. And it is precisely this group, with razor-sharp intuition, boundless empathy, and the ability to love so deeply that they touch the part the narcissist hides for a lifetime, who become the individuals. Narcissists make their greatest mistake with betrayal, because when a super empath is betrayed, they don't just hurt, they awaken. And when they awaken, they withdraw the one thing the narcissist depends on most, the light that once illuminated their darkness. This creates a paradox most people never see. The narcissist thinks they are winning when they betray an honest heart, but that very moment triggers a collapse they never saw coming. This is not an external collapse, not losing a job, a partner, or a reputation. This is an inner collapse, right at the core of what Jung called the psyche's shadow chamber, the dark room, where a person confronts the parts of themselves they've run from their entire life. A super empath is not an angel. They are not a victim. They are a person whose inner light is so powerful that the narcissist's darkness is both attracted to it and threatened by it. They are the only ones who allow the narcissist's illusion to momentarily hold a human shape. And that is why, when a narcissist betrays them, what gets destroyed is not the empath, but the artificial structure the narcissist depends on to exist. The betrayal is like pulling the plug on an already unstable psychological system. It shatters the mirror the narcissist used to see their idealized self. And when that mirror breaks, they have nothing left to reflect onto, nothing left to cling to, no one left to blame. Only their own shadow, what Jung described as the deepest fear of humanity, is confronting one's true nature. And for this reason, betraying a super empath is not a mistake in love. It is a mistake of the soul. It triggers an irreversible collapse in someone who lives through reflection rather than truth. This is why betraying a super empath is always the moment the narcissist begins to fall not from an external cliff, but into their own inner abyss. Part 1. The true nature of the super empath. To understand why betraying a super empath triggers the narcissist's collapse, we need to go one level deeper into the psychological structure of the highest form of empath, the type of soul that modern articles, forums, and healing communities call the super empath, but which in essence Jung had already laid the foundations to describe within his analytical psychology. Jung never used the term super empath. That is true, but he described in great detail a type of person whose intuition is so highly developed that they can sense truth before truth has the chance to speak itself. A type of person who carries the sacred wound of the wounded healer, allowing them to understand the depths others run away from. A type of person who has advanced so far on the individuation journey that the light inside them, the self that has been partially awakened, automatically exposes the darkness of anyone who stands close to them. This is not mystical power in a superstitious sense. This is a complex psychological configuration built from at least 3 elements Jung described clearly: differentiated and developed intuition, personal shadow that has been confronted and partially integrated, and the capacity to sense and connect with the broader layer of the collective unconscious. When these 3 elements not only exist, but are repeatedly trained through painful experiences, self-observation, and inner reflection, you get a person who can perceive the psychological essence of others without needing them to say a word. Modern research, such as Elaine Aron's work on the highly sensitive person, HSP, shows that individuals with heightened neural sensitivity, refined emotional processing, and deep cognitive engagement can read emotional nuances, energetic shifts, and micro signals far better than the average person, and when placed within the Jungian framework, this is precisely the intuitive function sharpened to the point of touching the unconscious layers behind behavior. A super empath is not someone who loves unconditionally in a naive way. They are someone who understands pain at its deepest level, and because they understand pain, they recognize another person's shadow long before that person becomes aware of it. Jung referred to people who operate like this as souls with a conscious intuitive function, an intuition detached from ego defenses, functioning almost like an independent perceptual organ. This allows them to sense dishonesty, distortion, insecurity, and cracks in someone's personality structure without any surface evidence. What ordinary people call a vague feeling, the super empath receives as raw data: a slight shift in facial expression, a change in the room's energetic tone, a half-tone deviation in someone's voice, a narrative that doesn't match the emotional undercurrent. For them, this is not a blurry instinct. It is the psyche's primordial truth, the starting point from which they understand the other person more deeply than that person understands themselves. And this is precisely what makes them dangerous in the eyes, or rather, the unconscious of the narcissist. The narcissist constructs an entire world around a persona, around a mask used to negotiate with life. The story that they are strong, intelligent, special, misunderstood, or a sensitive soul that nobody is deep enough to understand. They need these stories to avoid confronting their original shame, their sense of worthlessness, their abandonment wounds, or the underdeveloped fragments of their personality. But the super empath sees through that persona, not through logic, not by catching mistakes, but through a kind of intuition that borders on the spiritual, an intuition that detects the misalignment between the inner energy and the outer performance. They are not fully hypnotized by charm, not lulled by emotional performances, not persuaded for long by grand promises. They may feel touched, moved, or captivated, but the deepest part of them always knows something here doesn't add up. As note, they see the rest of the story, the parts the narcissist has spent an entire lifetime hiding: the fear of abandonment, the emptiness of their core self, the inability to self-regulate emotions, the core shame, and most importantly, the unlit shadow that has never been named, never been met. If we add Heinz Kohut's perspective, the father of self-psychology, we understand even more clearly the role of the super empath in the narcissist's inner world. Kohut explained that individuals with pathological narcissism lack a cohesive self. They depend on self-objects, other people who function as mirrors, idealized figures, or emotional regulators, to maintain a sense of being someone. The super empath, with their deep reflection and stable empathy, unconsciously becomes the perfect self-object. They see the potential, contain the wounds, and respond with understanding. And this is the psychological fuel the narcissist is addicted to. But the paradox emerges here. Because the super empath sees the darkness, they choose to love anyway. Not out of pure naivety, but because they embody the wounded healer archetype, they heal others through the wound in themselves. They believe their inner light is strong enough to reach that darkness, patient enough to remain while the other fights their shadow, resilient enough not to abandon them like everyone else did. Judith Herman's trauma research also shows that survivors of deep trauma sometimes develop an enhanced empathic capacity, combined with a belief that love, if persistent and authentic, can become a healing environment for both. This belief, when combined with narcissistic structure, forms a psychologically volatile compound. One sees an opportunity to manipulate, the other sees an opportunity to save. This is why the super empath becomes the narcissist's favorite target. They are not just supply. They are the ideal mirror through which the narcissist sees the perfect self projected back at them. Jung called this phenomenon transference of the ideal self. The narcissist uses another person as the mirror through which they see the version they cannot create from within. Among all mirrors, the super empath is the brightest, the deepest, and therefore the most dangerous. Bright because they carry the light of awareness, self-observation, and perception beyond illusion. Deep because they hold the depth of wounds that have been faced, metabolized, and understood rather than denied. Dangerous because they can look directly at darkness without fear, without trembling, without turning away. For this reason, when the narcissist betrays a super empath, the issue is not simply that they hurt a sensitive person. Psychologically, they are destroying the most beautiful, truthful, luminous mirror they ever had. They shatter the most essential self-object in Kohut's language, and they sever the deepest reflective source in Jung's language. And when that mirror disappears, Jung says the shadow, always waiting, rises and devours what remains of the ego, because there is no stable light left to balance it. That is when collapse happens. Not because of lost love in a romantic sense, but because the narcissist loses the mirror that sustained their false identity, loses the self-object that made them feel like somebody. Betraying a super empath is not just losing a person. It is losing the very mechanism that maintains their illusion of self. And without illusion to cling to, the narcissist is forced to face the raw truth they have avoided their entire life, except this time there is no super empath standing there to keep them from falling into the abyss. Part 2. Why the narcissist is pulled toward the super empath like a psychological destiny. There is a truth that very few people are perceptive enough to see. Narcissists are not drawn to super empaths because of their gentleness, their kindness, the way they love, or because they are easy to control, as simplistic surface-level stories often suggest. All of those reasons are just a thin coat of paint over a far more complex and deeper psychological mechanism. At the unconscious level, Jung spoke about the real reason a narcissist is drawn to a super empath from the very first moment is because they recognize not with words, but with instinct, that this person possesses the one thing they lack the most and lost very early on, the ability to see themselves honestly without collapsing. A super empath is not an ordinary mirror that simply reflects back the flattering image the narcissist wants to see. They are a rare mirror that simultaneously reflects the idealized ego. The narcissist is trying to construct and, at the same time, reveals the shadow they have spent their entire life running from. In the space between the super empath's light, the narcissist's real image and false image collide, and it is this collision that makes the attraction feel like a psychological destiny. It does not unfold through conscious choice, but through the invisible pull of the unconscious. Jung once said that whatever we deny in ourselves will appear outside as fate. For the narcissist, what is denied is the shadow child, the wounded, weak, ashamed, deprived self that had to be buried very early in order to survive. To cover it, they erect a glamorous persona, powerful, charming, moral, self-sacrificing, or pitiable, depending on their style. But the shadow does not disappear. It hides in the dark corner, waiting for a source of light real enough to be activated. The super empath is exactly that source of light, not a naive light that believes love alone will heal everything, but the light of a consciousness that has already fallen to the bottom, already collided with its own darkness, already been shattered and put back together, and therefore no longer fears the truth. They are the ones who have walked through pain deep enough to understand the pain of others, who see through defenses, pretense, and disguise, and touch directly the place the narcissist least wants anyone to reach. When a narcissist stands before someone like this, they are not just attracted, they are awakened. A part of their unconscious lights up and silently speaks words they will never say out loud. This person understands me. This person sees me. This person has what I don't have. This person makes me feel real. And even if their rational mind denies it, their ego resists it, and their inner fear trembles, they are still pulled in like metal to a magnet. That pull does not come from the super empath's sweetness or caretaking habits. It comes from their depth, from their capacity to sense what has not yet been spoken, to read energy before others dare to admit what they feel, to see the wound beneath the behavior, to understand the motive behind the mask, and to perceive the real human being that even its owner has abandoned. Jung called this the intuitive function of a differentiated psyche, the intuition of a mature consciousness that no longer operates from fantasy, but from lived experience with suffering and truth. This creates a dangerous paradox for the narcissist. No matter how much they perform, how cleverly they lie, how skillfully they manipulate, the super empath still senses that something is wrong, still perceives the fragments behind the polished surface. At an unconscious level, the narcissist knows this, even if they have no language for it. That is why they feel all at once curious, threatened, attracted, aroused, exposed, and stripped bare. That is the paradoxical magnetism of this bond. Light exposes shadow, but the shadow is drawn to light like a moth to a flame, not because it truly wants healing, but because it cannot tolerate being in the dark alone. At an even deeper level in Jungian psychoanalysis, this pull is also related to anima and animus, the unconscious feminine in a man and the unconscious masculine in a woman. In psychologically healthy individuals, anima divided by animus helps them love, bond, and connect in a mature way. In narcissists, this inner figure is distorted by the lack of real love, by experiences of abandonment, control, or emotional invalidation. As a result, they do not know how to love without possessing, how to attach without manipulating, how to be intimate without using the other person as a source of supply for their ego. Yet this distorted anima, divided by animus, still longs to be tied to an ideal image, and when they meet a super empath, it instantly locks on. The super empath becomes the embodiment of the love they never received, the gentleness they lacked, the understanding they never experienced, the safety their unconscious has always craved. In the narcissist's unconscious perception, the super empath is not just a romantic partner, they are the spiritual mother they never had, the listening father they never met, the mirror of the kind of human being they wish they could become but never will. This is more than an emotional connection. It is a form of unconscious identification. They do not just want to have the super empath. They want to become the person the super empath reflects back to them, but since they cannot, they cling to these people as if clinging to a lost fragment of their own soul. That is why narcissists hold on to super empaths, not with mature love, but with a desperate spiritual hunger. Notice that most people only ever see the version the narcissist wants them to see. Charming, smart, talented, selfless, moral, victimized, they are fooled by a carefully staged persona. The super empath is different. They are not drawn to the mask. They are drawn to and simultaneously warned by what lies beneath the loneliness in the eyes, even while the mouth is smiling. The panic behind the calm demeanor, the suppressed rage under the kindness, the inner emptiness behind the flashy success, the fear hidden beneath the confident posture, the weakness sitting just under the need for control. They perceive all of this not through rational deduction, but through intuition that has been forged in their own experiences of being hurt, betrayed, gaslit, and devalued. It is the wisdom of the survivor, something no book can teach. When the narcissist realizes there is someone who truly sees them at that level and still stays, they experience something they have almost never known in their life. Being seen without being immediately judged, being understood without being immediately abandoned, being recognized without having to perform. This creates a kind of temporary humanity. In the moments they are with the super empath, they feel closer to their real self than to their mask. They become addicted to that feeling, but at the same time they are terrified by it, because along with it comes the danger of being exposed, stripped of illusion, and pulled out of their safe fantasy world. For this reason, the relationship quickly turns into a paradoxical field of forces. The narcissist wants the super empath close enough to keep feeling real, but far enough not to be fully seen. They idealize the super empath as the greatest gift of their life, while secretly resenting them for unconsciously revealing parts of themselves they cannot tolerate. They fear losing the super empath, and simultaneously destroy them through control, tests of limits, wounding, and betrayal. On the other side, the super empath is not innocent in this fate either. Their own wounds, the need to be truly loved, to be recognized, to save someone, lead them to see healing potential in the narcissist, where they should be seeing unprocessed damage. They see the wounded child inside the narcissist and forget the adult who is actively choosing to hurt them. Thus, both sides are drawn to what they lack. On one side, mature light. On the other, unhealed darkness. On one side, the capacity to integrate shadow. On the other, dissociation and fragmentation that are never acknowledged. That is why this encounter is never neutral. It becomes either a violent awakening or a slow destruction. This pull is not random, not a case of accidentally meeting the wrong person, but bears the quality of a spiritual destiny. The super empath awakens the part of the narcissist they have buried and fled from all their life, while the narcissist awakens in the super empath the part they never thought they needed to protect their self-respect, their boundaries, their awareness of the value of their own soul. Because of this, the attraction is both powerful and dangerous, and it almost always moves toward a breaking point. Either the super empath awakens and leaves, or both drag each other into the abyss. But one thing does not change. This very type of pull is the starting point of the narcissist's eventual collapse, because they have stepped too close to the only person capable of reflecting back to them the true extent of the emptiness inside. Part 3. The moment of betrayal. The psychological break where truth rips off every mask. The moment a narcissist betrays a super empath is never merely an act of cruelty or selfishness, as outsiders often assume. From a psychoanalytic perspective, it is the moment when two opposing energetic forces, the narcissist's delusional ego and the super empath's depth of awareness, finally collide with enough intensity to expose the truth both have been avoiding, though in completely different ways. For the narcissist, betrayal is a survival reflex of a psyche that cannot tolerate being seen too deeply. For the super empath, betrayal becomes the catalyst that forces their soul to confront the contradiction between their own worth and the emotional chaos of the other person. What makes this moment a psychological breaking point is not the act of betrayal itself, but the unconscious nature behind it. In Jung's analysis, every extreme reaction arises from the conflict between the persona, the social mask, and the shadow, the denied self. The narcissist does not betray in order to leave. They betray in order to escape the feeling of being seen too clearly by someone with the psychological penetration of a super empath. On an unconscious level, they believe that by breaking the bond, they can break the super empath's ability to shine light on their unformed inner psyche. But what they cannot know is that this act becomes the beginning of their inner collapse, because it is the moment they unplug themselves from the only source of psychic energy that ever kept their ego structure standing. Meanwhile, for the super empath, betrayal does not destroy them, it awakens them. And this awakening does not come from anger or heartbreak, but from the subtle recognition that individuals with differentiated consciousness often experience. They see that betrayal is not just about the narcissist's action, but about the level of unresolved chaos embedded in that person's psychological structure. A super empath does not merely witness betrayal. They perceive the entire psychological map that led to it: fear of intimacy, distortion in the anima divided by animus structure, dependence on ego, image, weak self-reflection, and above all, a lack of emotional self-regulation. Because of this comprehensive insight, betrayal affects the super empath in a very different way. It forces them out of an emotional fusion state, a state they once allowed themselves to enter in order to connect deeply. Neurologically speaking, super empaths exhibit higher than average empathic capacity, with amplified mirror neuron activity and a highly sensitive limbic system. When they are betrayed, the bond does not break through emotion, it breaks through cognition. They do not stop loving because of pain, they stop merging because of understanding. This is the shift from empathic attunement to metacognitive awareness, a shift the narcissist cannot follow because their psyche is not developed enough to reach it. In that moment of clarity, a subtle but decisive shift happens in the entire unconscious bond between the two. The super empath retracts inner permission. What the narcissist never understands is this: the super empath is bound not by dependency but by permission. When that permission is revoked, the entire power of the super empath pulls out of the system. And this withdrawal is what causes the narcissist to enter what Jung called the collapse of the psychological skin. The narcissist does not lose a person. They lose the psychological scaffolding that held their ego together. They lose the mirror through which they saw their idealized self. They lose the unconscious light that helped them momentarily escape their inner darkness. In contrast, the super empath undergoes the opposite process. They enter a state of cognitive awakening. This is not the first time they have been hurt in life, but it is the first time they realize that this pain did not come to break them, but to return them to themselves. Instead of shattering like most people, the super empath enters what researchers call functional detachment. They do not shut down their emotions. They simply pull the energy of their identity out of the equation. This allows them to clearly perceive the developmental gap between themselves and the narcissist. They realize they had been in a bond where they were doing the emotional growing for both, while the other person clung to them without maturing. And this realization triggers a profound shift in spiritual power. The narcissist believes they are discarding the super empath, but they do not realize they have just lost the only person who ever lifted them out of their inner abyss. When the super empath withdraws emotional fusion, the narcissist feels the energetic drop immediately. But here is the key. They do not feel it as the loss of a person. They feel it as the loss of a part of themselves. That is why the moment of betrayal is not the moment the narcissist wins over the super empath. It is the moment they unconsciously initiate their own downfall. The super empath does not seek justice, revenge, or validation. They simply step back into the axis of their own spiritual center. But it is precisely this upright stance that exposes the degree of collapse inside the narcissist's psychological structure. The more grounded the spiritually mature person becomes, the more the unhealed psyche destabilizes. This is the essence of the betrayal moment. The narcissist believes they are freeing themselves from the super empath's light. But they do not understand that the ego they are running from will be the first force to turn against them. And from that moment on, collapse becomes inevitable. Part 4, the psychological collapse of the narcissist after losing the super empath. When the grandiose ego falls into the spiritual void, the narcissist's collapse after losing a super empath is not a simple emotional reaction. It is a multi-layered psychological breakdown that psychoanalysts from Jung, Kohut, and Kernberg to modern neuroscientists have interpreted from several interconnected angles. From the outside, people assume the narcissist is fine, quickly with someone new, or moving on effortlessly. But what happens inside is the exact opposite. A fracture and implosion of the ego structure, silent, chaotic, and irreversible. Jung called this state the uprising of the shadow when the light disappears. Kohut called it the collapse of the self-object structure. Kernberg described it as identity diffusion leading to decompensation. Research from Bowlby on attachment trauma and Linehan on emotional dysregulation shows that the childhood wounds at the core of narcissistic pathology, abandonment, emotional invalidation, chaos can erupt violently once their external emotional regulator is removed. And the super empath unconsciously was that regulator. When they leave, the narcissist does not lose a person. They lose the psychological scaffolding that held their fragile ego together. Ego destabilization, the first layer of collapse. At the first level, the narcissist experiences ego destabilization, a collapse in their ability to maintain a coherent sense of self. During the relationship, they unconsciously use the super empath as an external extension of the mind, exactly as Heinz Kohut's self-object concept describes. Narcissistic individuals need others to stabilize, mirror, and reinforce their sense of identity. The super empath's emotional stability, deep attunement, intuitive mirroring, and steady presence became the invisible foundation holding together the narcissist's distorted ego. Kohut's 1970 seconds research shows that when a self-object is withdrawn, individuals with weak ego structure experience self-fragmentation, a splitting of the self leading to panic, emotional chaos, and sometimes extreme behavior. This explains why narcissists immediately seek new supply. Ends 4. Not because they've moved on, but because their psyche is in ego withdrawal, desperately needing a substitute to avoid internal collapse. Identity diffusion, the second layer of collapse. On a deeper level, the narcissist's collapse appears as identity diffusion, the phenomenon Kernberg described. While with the super empath, they borrow the empath's light to temporarily create the illusion of who they wish to be. Once that light is gone, they have no inner identity to return to, because the self they presented was never internally built, it was externally assembled. This produces extremely distinct psychological symptoms: emptiness even with a new partner, meaninglessness even during happy moments, threat reactions even without conflict. In Jung's framework, this is the moment when the shadow devours the persona because nothing remains to hold them apart. Without the super empath's mirroring, the narcissist's mask loses the energy that sustained it, and the shadow, the rejected, undeveloped self, surges upward. This inner rupture puts the narcissist in a state of fear, aggression, longing, avoidance, rage, and dependency, simultaneously exactly the pattern Dr. Otto Kernberg described as the clash between the two poles of an immature psyche. Emotional nervous system breakdown, the deepest pain. The deepest layer of collapse occurs in the emotional nervous system. Neuroscience shows clear abnormalities in the narcissistic brain. Low activity in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions responsible for empathy and emotional processing. High activity in the limbic system, the center of emotional reactivity and threat detection. This creates a painful paradox. They cannot feel others' emotions, yet they overreact to any threat to their ego. When the super empath leaves, the narcissist's limbic system erupts in what Bowlby described as attachment panic. But because they cannot process or label emotion, they convert this panic into rage, blame, impulsive new relationships, attention-seeking, manipulation to regain control. Research by Dr. Elsa Ronningstam, Harvard, shows that when a narcissist loses a primary emotional regulator like a super empath, they enter a state similar to withdrawal from an addictive substance: agitation, disorientation, craving emotional stimulation, intensified control behaviors. This is why they return to the super empath, not from love, but because their ego is bleeding out. Collapse of meaning, the spiritual breakdown. At the deepest psychological and spiritual level, Jung called this the collapse of meaning. The super empath was more than a partner. They were the narcissist's source of psychic order. When they disappear, the narcissist's inner world becomes disorganized. They lose the feeling of being truly seen. They lose the illusion of being special. They lose the only person capable of understanding the chaos behind their mask. This triggers a specific form of obsession, not romantic, but existential. They cannot replace the psychological framework the super empath created for them. Modern psychology refers to this as psychological imprinting. The super empath becomes a permanent template within the narcissist's nervous system, the only model of being perceived without judgment. When that template disappears, the narcissist searches for it endlessly, but no one matches the depth, and disappointment grows. This is why narcissists often destroy new relationships. They unconsciously compare every new person to the one whose depth they lost, but they lack the emotional vocabulary to admit it. Dopamine and energy system crash. The final stage. On a neurochemical level, losing the super empath disrupts the narcissist's dopamine regulation system. Individuals with narcissistic traits commonly show dopamine dysregulation. They require constant stimulation to feel stable. The super empath, through their depth and emotional resonance, becomes a powerful source of stable dopamine. When that source is removed, their nervous system enters a reward system crash. This leads to panic, drama seeking, impulsive supply hunting, sabotaging relationships for adrenaline, emotional volatility. But none of these substitutes work long term because their system has adapted to the emotional intensity that only a super empath can create. The irreversible realization, the beginning of obsession. Eventually, the narcissist reaches an internal truth they will never admit aloud. They destroyed the only person who ever saw them beyond their mask. And from that realization onward begins the lifelong obsession, not because they love the super empath, but because they know deep down that they will never again encounter a soul capable of sustaining the spiritual light they lost. In Jung's perspective, this is the moment the shadow fully devours the persona, and the soul that was never healed falls back into its own darkness. Part 5, The Rise of the Super Empath, Awakening After Betrayal, and the Reconstruction of the Soul. What sets the super empath apart from every other form of empath is not gentleness, kindness, or an unusually high tolerance for pain. The true difference lies in their capacity for self-rebirth. When they are betrayed, they do not break in the ordinary way. They enter a cycle Freud called mourning work, Kohut called transformative narcissistic injury, and Jung described as the alchemical nigredo, the phase where darkness swallows everything, yet a new seed of consciousness is quietly born. For the super empath, betrayal is not an ending. It is a hyphen between two entirely different spiritual stages. And when the narcissist delivers the final blow, the super empath does not collapse emotionally, they collapse cognitively because they see the truth so clearly that they can no longer deny it. The only thing that truly breaks in them is the illusion. And the collapse of illusion is precisely what creates space for the true self to emerge. The shift from fusion to differentiation. In the first phase of this awakening, the super empath's nervous system shifts from fusion, emotional merging, to differentiation, self-other distinction. Research on mirror neurons shows that deep empaths tend to absorb and reflect other people's emotions as if they were their own. But once they experience betrayal that shocks their cognitive system, the frontal limbic network begins to reorganize. Instead of merging to understand, they begin to observe to discern. This is the birth of functional detachment. They are not cold, but they no longer allow other people's emotions to pierce their boundaries. This is the first step of spiritual sovereignty, retrieving the projections, the end of illusion. Next, the super empath begins to retrieve their energy in a way most people never learn. Psychoanalysis calls this withdrawn projection. Throughout their time with the narcissist, the super empath projected hope, trust, goodness, potential, and healing narratives onto the other person. Betrayal marks the moment they pull all those projections back, like reclaiming light from a place unworthy of it. This retrieval creates a spiritual shock for the narcissist, as explained in Part 4, but for the super empath, it opens a critical phase. They see themselves more clearly than ever before. This is when they confront a truth Jung articulated. A part of the soul awakens only when we hit our own limits. Betrayal is that limit. It forces the super empath to ask the question they were never brave enough to ask before. Why did I abandon myself to save someone who didn't want to be saved? This question activates the transcendent function, Jung's mechanism of psychological transformation and the cornerstone of individuation. At this stage, the super empath does not merely heal, they evolve. They do not just mend the wound, they integrate their shadow. They do not simply leave the relationship, they leave behind an entire version of themselves. Awakening from the healer role. A crucial psychological shift now occurs. The super empath awakens from the role of the healer. Their deep empathy, once the very trait that made them carry emotional responsibility for others, becomes the foundation for a new understanding. Healing never emerges from self-sacrifice, especially not from trying to rescue someone actively resisting the light. Research by Dr. Elaine Aron, Highly Sensitive People, and Judith Herman, Trauma Bonding, shows that when highly sensitive individuals experience betrayal from a deep attachment figure, they often undergo a kind of radical cognition. They don't just leave the relationship, they leave the entire unhealthy attachment mechanism behind. This is why, after betrayal, the narcissist loses all control over the super empath. Hoovering no longer works. Emotional scripts fall flat. Guilt manipulation loses force. Their empathy is now bonded to self-worth, not to the compulsion to save. Identity reconstruction, becoming someone new. Once awakening reaches a certain depth, the super empath enters the next stage, identity reconstruction. Carl Rogers' research on the self-concept shows that human identity is deeply shaped by core relationships. But when a destructive relationship is cut off, the self reorganizes toward authenticity. For the super empath, this reorganization is amplified. They rebuild boundaries, recalibrate their nervous system, reassess where their energy flows, refine their attachment style, and no longer react to emotional chaos as they once did. Even more fascinating is the neurobiological effect, what we can call the post-liberation stabilization. As they exit the narcissist's chaotic emotional field, their nervous system returns to its natural balance. Cortisol drops, oxytocin returns, serotonin stabilizes, dopamine recalibrates. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains that leaving a dysregulated relationship allows the vagus nerve to recover, leading to deeper calm, enhanced intuition, and profound emotional maturity. The super empath becomes a spiritually fortified version of themselves. Deeper, clearer, steadier, and exponentially harder to manipulate. The sovereign state, the final stage. Then something extraordinary happens. The super empath no longer looks at the narcissist with pain, but with understanding. This is an extremely rare psychological state. No anger, no desire for revenge, no longing, no need for closure, only clarity. Clarity lifts them out of the emotional loop that once held them captive. When they step out, they generate what psychoanalysts call the sovereign state, a state of inner authority and self-possession. This is the moment the super empath is no longer shaped by the external world. They stand fully within their mature self. And this is the narcissist's greatest fear. The narcissist's deepest fear is not vengeance, not exposure, not consequences. Their deepest fear is the super empath's evolution. The super empath does not punish, they outgrow. They do not return, they rise. They do not seek closure from the narcissist. They find closure within their own soul. They do not need to prove their worth because they have finally seen it. They become the person the narcissist always pretended to be, but could never become. And this rise, the spiritual rebirth of the super empath, is what shatters the narcissist's entire psychological structure in the chapters that follow. Part 6, the narcissist's panic when the super empath never returns. Shadow awakens, illusion shatters, ego collapses. When a super empath leaves and never comes back, what happens inside the narcissist is not sadness, not regret, and certainly not the remorse they may display outwardly. What happens is a deep, primal panic in the underdeveloped ego, a survival-level terror that Carl Jung, Otto Kernberg, Heinz Kohut, and Stephen Porges each describe from different angles, which, when combined, form a complete picture of the narcissist's inevitable inner collapse. The first thing that triggers this panic is not emotional loss, it is the loss of reflection. Jung noted that egos which have not integrated their shadow cannot self-reflect. They exist only as an image sustained by the gaze of others. In the narcissist case, the super empath is not just a lover, they are the mirror reflecting the narcissist's idealized self. When that mirror disappears and does not return, the narcissist falls into what modern researchers call a self-disintegration crisis. The reason is simple and terrifying. They do not know who they are without the super empath's gaze. The narcissist has no idea what their value is without someone to illuminate it. They do not know what their ideal self looks like without someone reflecting it back. And they have no internal psychological structure to keep their ego standing on its own. This leads to the first stage of panic, the ego vacuum. Next, another mechanism appears, one that Bowlby called attachment panic, and which neuropsychological research describes as hyperactivation of the limbic system when the primary source of emotional regulation disappears. When the super empath does not return, the narcissist's nervous system goes into alarm mode, not because of love, but because of fear. Fear of what? Fear of facing themselves. Fear of seeing their own inner darkness without the filter of someone else's light. Fear of feeling emotions the super empath once unconsciously absorbed for them. The absence of the super empath reveals a reality the narcissist has spent their whole life avoiding. All the chaos they once dumped onto the empath no longer has anywhere to go. It rebounds back onto them. This is the first psychological backlash that creates true panic. There is no one left to carry my shadow for me. As this fear activates, the narcissist enters the third stage, psychic withdrawal syndrome. Research by Elsa Ronningstam at Harvard shows that narcissists are heavily dependent on emotional supply from others, and when that supply suddenly disappears, they experience symptoms similar to substance withdrawal. Agitation, disorientation, seeking quick pleasure, vague panic, dopamine crashes, and the urgent need to replace the lost source. So when the super empath doesn't come back, the narcissist does not search for someone new because they have forgotten you. They search because their ego is in a state of oxygen deprivation. What they do not realize is this: no new source can replicate the spiritual intensity the super empath once provided. Because the super empath's light was never just romantic love, it was a deep reflection of their very nature as a human being. The more they seek someone new, the more empty they feel. The more they try to start over, the more disoriented they become. The more they try to cover it up, the more terrified they feel. On a deeper level, the narcissist's panic arises from the loss of an external emotional regulation function. The super empath once unconsciously absorbed their chaotic energy, softened it, metabolized it, and returned a sense of stability the narcissist could not generate on their own. This is what Daniel Siegel calls interpersonal neurobiological regulation, nervous system regulation through relationship. When the super empath leaves, the narcissist's nervous system can no longer regulate cortisol, adrenaline, or internal emotional swings. They fall into affective dysregulation. This leads to extreme behaviors: sudden anger without cause, generalized anxiety, paranoia, everyone is against me, or a numb, paralyzed emptiness that Kernberg calls emptiness collapse. But the highest level of panic does not occur in the ego or the nervous system. It occurs in the Jungian unconscious. The narcissist is forced to confront their original shadow for the first time in their life. When the super empath does not return, the narcissist's persona no longer has anyone to sustain it, and it starts to shed in pieces. As the persona falls away, the shadow, the part buried since childhood, surfaces without the supervision of light. Jung called this state shadow possession. This is when the narcissist becomes most dangerous, not to others, but to themselves. They start sabotaging new relationships, provoking conflict, creating drama, and unconsciously harming themselves. At this stage, their panic is no longer about losing the super empath. It has become something larger. The fear that they will never again recover the version of themselves they once believed was real. Kaplan, a researcher of narcissistic collapse, wrote, "The collapse of the narcissist begins when there is no longer anyone to reflect their idealized self back at them. And that is exactly what happens when the super empath does not return. The narcissist realizes, though they will never admit it, that they destroyed the only person who ever saw them without disgust, loved them without conditions, and understood them without condemnation. The final panic is existential. They can no longer escape into love, narratives, drama, blame, or new supply. They must face what they have been fleeing their entire life. There is nothing beneath the mask. And that is the beginning of the total collapse that will unfold in the next stage. Part 7. Psychological karma and shadow possession. When darkness devours the narcissist after losing the super empath, psychological karma is not some vague metaphysical concept. In depth psychology, it is the inevitable return of rejected unconscious material demanding to exist. Jung once said, "What we refuse to face will return as our destiny." When a narcissist betrays a super empath and then loses them forever, that moment opens a brutal process Jung called shadow possession. This is not a single event, but a painful reverse evolution in which the ego is stripped layer by layer, and the inner darkness begins to spill out with no restraint from the light the super empath once provided. As long as the super empath was there, they unconsciously slowed this process. Once they are gone, the shadow meets no resistance and starts invading the narcissist from within. Shadow possession begins with open conflict between persona, the mask, and shadow. Once the super empath leaves, there is no one left to reinforce the narcissist's persona. The weakened persona loses its function, allowing the shadow full of shame, envy, hurt, rage, and abandonment terror to rise and take control of the psyche. This is when the narcissist loses self-control and engages in increasingly self-destructive behaviors. Kernberg's work on narcissistic decompensation shows that the greater the conflict between the ego ideal self, and the real self, the more violent the collapse. And by disappearing, the super empath detonates that inner conflict. The next stage of shadow possession is what psychoanalysts call the narcissistic karma loop, a recurring cycle of 3 elements: suffering, denial, self-destructive behavior, more suffering. It is a self-amplifying psychological spiral in which the more the narcissist tries to escape, the deeper they sink. Without the super empath's stable presence to absorb chaotic energy, their nervous system becomes overloaded. Research by Daniel Siegel and Stephen Porges shows that under chronic dysregulated stress, the body is prone to abnormal fight, flight, freeze responses. For the narcissist, this appears as sudden disproportionate rage, paranoid outbursts, dramatic narratives that everyone is against me, or escapism through addictions, sex, spending, or reckless relationships. These are not merely bad habits, they are signs of a psyche being driven by its own shadow. Another form of psychological karma emerges here called echo trauma. The echo of wounds they once inflicted on others now reverberating inside them. When the super empath never returns, the narcissist's nervous system and psyche no longer have anyone to dump their emotional chaos onto. The lies, manipulation, emotional carelessness they once acted out toward the super empath now become inner echoes. And the bitter irony is, they cannot stand themselves. Gabor Mate once said, "The pain we refuse to heal becomes the voice of the shadow, and it speaks through self-destruction." At this stage, the super empath, though long gone, still exists as a negative image in the narcissist's mind, a contrast that makes them keenly aware of the difference between the light they once had and the darkness now consuming them. No one needs to punish the narcissist, their own nervous system does it. One of the deepest forms of terror here is identity implosion, the explosion of identity from the inside. Without the super empath to reflect their idealized self, the narcissist no longer knows who they are. This is not a vague philosophical, "who am I?" It is a paralysis of identity akin to dissociation. Kernberg describes this state as a self reduced to an empty frame with no content. Research on complex PTSD shows that when a personality structure depends on another person to maintain inner cohesion, that person's departure produces a kind of disintegration of identity. The narcissist is not haunted by the super empath as a person. They are haunted by the version of themselves that only existed in the super empath's light. They don't miss the person. They miss the light, but that light is gone forever. At a deeper stage, the shadow creates a phenomenon called moral inversion. The narcissist begins to reinterpret their suffering as the super empath's fault. They betrayed me. They abandoned me. They became too independent. And they think they're better than me. None of this is true. All of it is the shadow's projection, used to avoid facing the reality that they were the betrayer. But the more they blame, the more guilt they feel. And the more guilt they feel, the stronger the shadow becomes. This is another form of psychological karma. The very words they once used to twist reality now return as mirrors they cannot break. Another symptom of shadow possession is the emergence of substitute images. The narcissist seeks new people to cast the super empath's image onto. But because no one else has that same depth, disappointment grows. Every new relationship becomes a failed replica of the old one, and they replay the same destructive pattern: idealize, devalue, despise, discard. The more the cycle repeats, the stronger the shadow becomes. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the unconscious urge to recreate the original wound in hopes of resolving it. But the narcissist does not resolve anything. They only deepen their own pit. In the final stage of shadow possession, the narcissist enters a state of existential terror. This is no longer fear of losing someone. It is fear of losing themselves, losing the mask, losing the ego, losing the sense of I exist. Jung described this as the descent into the abyss of an unillumined soul. They begin to experience signs similar to nihilism. Life feels meaningless, empty, disconnected. They may still laugh, love, seduce, or find new partners, but inside there is a cold, expanding void. This is the final psychological karma. They become the victim of the very emptiness they once inflicted on others. Shadow possession does not kill them physically. It kills them at the level of identity. And the most painful part is not that the super empath left, but the realization, buried deep in their unconscious, that they will never again find the version of themselves they could only touch temporarily. In the super empath's light, part 8, when the super empath is no longer supply, light becomes a mirror that exposes the truth. There is a moment almost no narcissist is ever psychologically prepared to face. The moment when the super empath, the one who used to be their light, their container, their comfort, their psychological nourishment, no longer plays that role. Not because the super empath has become cold, not because they have shut off their feelings, not because they ran out of love, but because they have awakened. This awakening is unlike any change the narcissist has ever encountered. It is not loud, not theatrical, not announced. It is a shift in being a reorientation of attention and energy, where the super empath withdraws all of their focus from the narcissist's darkness and returns it to their own soul. This creates a psychological effect psychoanalysts call mirror disruption. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What the narcissist never understood is that the super empath was the mirror they used to avoid that very darkness. As long as the super empath was present, the narcissist could project their idealized ego image onto the empath and use the empath's deep attunement to maintain a distorted sense of self. But when that mirror is withdrawn, something unprecedented begins to happen. They see themselves without the empath's light softening the ugliness of their inner shadow. This opens a crucial psychological phenomenon many researchers call collapse through deprivation, a breakdown caused by the loss of unconscious nourishment. In object relations theory, Donald Winnicott called this falling without a holding environment, falling into emptiness when there is no longer an emotional environment to catch you. The super empath is precisely that holding environment for the narcissist's chaotic emotions. When they withdraw, the narcissist's nervous system goes into a panic state similar to an infant being separated from its mother. Not because they love the super empath, but because the super empath was the one keeping their psyche from completely falling apart. This explains why an ordinary person can lose someone they love, feel deep sadness, and still live. But when a narcissist loses a super empath, they experience a level of ego collapse no one else can trigger. The super empath is not just a special person. They are the only one who ever gave the narcissist the feeling, I exist more fully when I am with this person. When that feeling disappears, they do not just lose someone, they lose the version of themselves they loved most, a version sustained by the light and reflection of the super empath. At a deeper level, this creates what can be called mirror starvation. Heinz Kohut's research shows that people with pathological narcissism have an intense need for mirroring, and when the source of mirroring disappears, they experience a collapse he called fragmentation. But with a super empath, this fragmentation is even more severe, because the super empath did not just mirror, they mirrored truthfully. And it is that truthfulness the narcissist was truly addicted to. Others can praise them, inflate them, confirm their ego, but only the super empath has seen them in their most fragile, exposed moments and did not run. This creates a type of bond neuroscientists call relational imprinting. When this imprint is lost, the brain regions associated with emotional pain, such as the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, light up intensely, similar to physical pain. In other words, the narcissist literally feels as if part of their body has been torn away, even if they will never admit it. But the greatest tragedy lies here. When the super empath withdraws their energy, they do not just stop loving, they stop mirroring. And when reflective light shuts off, the shadow appears in its raw form. There is no one left to blame, to control, to manipulate, to drain. They are confronted with themselves with no layers left to hide behind. This is a state many psychoanalysts describe as inner exposure trauma, trauma from being exposed to one's own inner world. It doesn't come from an external attack, but from the crumbling of internal illusions. The super empath does not hit back, does not take revenge, does not fight. They simply disappear at the precise moment the narcissist needs them most to stay psychologically intact. And that is exactly what makes the narcissist collapse. Another crucial dimension is the contrast effect. Once the narcissist has been exposed to the super empath's light and then loses it, every subsequent relationship feels empty, shallow, and soulless. Research by Baumeister and other behavioral scientists shows that once a person experiences a deep level of emotional connection, they can no longer be satisfied with something significantly less. This explains why. The narcissist may date many people after the super empath, but nobody reaches them. Not because those new relationships are objectively bad, but because the super empath has set an internal baseline too high. A baseline no one else can meet, because no one else has the same depth. But more importantly, the super empath is no longer giving that to them, and that is their life sentence. The most powerful psychological phenomenon triggered when the super empath withdraws is what we might call the great reversal, the reversal of energetic roles. When the empath was still there, the narcissist was the center of the story. When the empath leaves, the empath becomes the center of the truth. Losing them is not just losing a person. It is losing the axis around which the ego revolved. In that moment, the super empath, though they never return, becomes a permanent mirror, not reflecting the idealized ego, but reflecting the consequences. The narcissist looks at the super empath's life after leaving and sees the one truth all narcissists fear the most. This person is not just okay, they are better. This creates an existential shock that Jonathan Shedler and other researchers describe as narcissistic injury of witnessing the other thrive. It is the deepest narcissistic wound because it destroys the illusion. Without me, they will fall apart. Instead, the opposite happens. The super empath becomes deeper, stronger, brighter, more purified. They are living proof that darkness cannot kill light. It is light that dissolves darkness. And this is when the ultimate truth is revealed. The super empath never needed the narcissist, but the narcissist always needed the super empath to feel like they had value. When this truth comes to the surface, the entire pathological narcissistic structure begins to collapse from within. Part 9. Why betraying a super empath always leads to the narcissist personality collapse. When a narcissist betrays a super empath, they believe it is their final victory, that they have proven their power, their control, their superiority, that they have successfully crushed the heart of the person they judged as soft, empathic, and easily wounded. What they do not know and would never foresee is that in the exact moment they think they have won, they have activated the deepest collapse mechanism of their own personality. This is not about karma in a mystical sense, not about payback, not about morality. It is about a psychological law, Jung stated very clearly. When we try to extinguish light, it is our own darkness that devours us first. The moment the narcissist betrays the super empath is the moment they shatter the only mirror that ever helped keep their ego standing. In psychoanalytic terms, this is called self-fragmentation via object trauma. Ego collapse caused by destroying the most important psychological object. The super empath is not just a lover. They are the psychic object that unconsciously stabilizes the narcissistic personality from within, even if neither of them fully realizes it. Jung describes this in archetypal language. The super empath embodies the archetype of the self, the center of wholeness the narcissist can never reach on their own, while the narcissist operates only from the ego, a distorted structure built on persona and defense. When they betray the super empath, they are not just rejecting a person, they are rejecting the inner archetype they have been parasitically feeding on. That moment creates a crack no new supply or therapy can truly repair. This is why betraying a super empath always leads to narcissistic collapse. The first thing that collapses is the balance between persona and shadow. In Jungian theory, every psyche has two aspects: the persona, the social mask, and the shadow, the rejected part. The narcissist lives almost entirely in the persona, that idealized ego, the fake perfection, the fake morality, the staged intelligence, the curated image they use to protect a fragile self. The super empath has the capacity to see through this persona, and their presence paradoxically keeps the persona stable rather than shattering. Their light acts as a regulating counterforce. When they are betrayed and leave, the persona is no longer regulated, no longer mirrored by the super empath's honest reflection. Jung calls this persona decomposition. The mask begins to crack because there is no longer an opposing light to keep it in balance. And when the persona cracks, the shadow immediately rises. But the narcissist's shadow is not just a collection of rejected traits. It is a primal chaos sealed off since childhood, fear of abandonment, primal shame, core feelings of not enough, the agony of never having been truly loved, attachment deficit. These emotions could not surface while the super empath was there, because the empath unconsciously absorbed them. Once the super empath is gone, the narcissist is forced to face the original shadow, a darkness they have no skills, no tools, and no internal empathy to handle. This is the beginning of a personality collapse in the clinical sense. The second thing that happens is the rebound of projection. Throughout the relationship, the narcissist constantly threw their shame, rage, helplessness, and guilt onto the super empath through projection and projective identification. While the connection was intact, these emotions were contained by the empath's capacity to hold and process them. But when the bond is cut after betrayal, all that repressed material has nowhere to go. Psychoanalysts like Bion and Ogden call this the collapse of the container function. Everything the narcissist once dumped into the empath now drops back into their own already fragile nervous system. They begin to experience anxiety, emptiness, rage, panic, and deep inner conflict they can no longer offload onto anyone else. With no container, no holder, no empath to process it for them, they drown in the very darkness they were running from. This is the type of breakdown many studies describe as affective implosion, an emotional explosion turned inward. Third, betraying the super empath destroys the pathological attachment foundation the narcissist depended on. Narcissists do not love in a mature way, but they do form primitive emotional dependence. When they betray the empath, they assume the empath will be devastated, weak, clinging, and eventually return. When the opposite happens, when the super empath becomes silent, stands up, leaves, without hatred, without begging, without revenge, it creates a nervous shock specialists call attachment disconfirmation. They thought they knew the empath. They thought the empath was weak. They thought they had them under control. When the empath walks away without collapsing, the narcissist is forced to confront the most dangerous truth. They were never as powerful as they believed. This destroys the entire foundation of their ego. Betraying the super empath is not just betrayal, it is the narcissist smashing their own self-concept with their own hands. Finally, according to Jung and modern research, betraying a super empath leads to a collapse that is existential in nature, ego death without rebirth. The super empath goes through ego death in order to be reborn, to mature, to move into a higher level of consciousness. The narcissist, however, goes through ego death in the opposite direction. Their ego disintegrates, but they have no capacity for rebirth because their shadow is too vast, their persona too thin, and their self was never truly formed. This is when they truly break. Not because they lost the empath, but because they lost the ego structure the empath was silently maintaining for them. This is why betraying a super empath always leads to the narcissist's personality collapse, because they do not just lose a person. They lose the most stable version of themselves they ever had, the version that only existed when a soul strong enough, bright enough, and deep enough stood beside them. When we look back at the entire journey between a super empath and a narcissist, we don't just see a distorted love story. We don't just see hurt, betrayal, or manipulation. We are witnessing a psychological phenomenon of archetypal nature, a living symbol that Carl Jung described a century ago, the battle between conscious light and unacknowledged darkness. And the observer might think this battle has only two possible endings. Either the empath loses and is destroyed, or the narcissist wins and continues to live in their illusion. But the truth is the exact opposite. When a super empath awakens, the narcissist's game doesn't just end, it ceases to exist. Not because the empath takes revenge, not because the empath becomes cruel, not because the empath uses the narcissist's tactics against them, but because the empath steps out of the entire energetic field the narcissist operates in. When the super empath awakens, they no longer exist on the same psychological frequency as the narcissist. And when two states of consciousness no longer overlap, darkness can no longer cling to light. This is the ending the narcissist never imagines because it does not look like a battle. It takes the shape of absolute silence, like sunlight making the darkness disappear without ever having to fight it. What is the awakening of a super empath? It is not outer toughness. It is not a sudden hardness. It is not rage or rebellion. It is a structural change of the soul, a foundational inner shift that neuroscience calls neural reorganization, and Jung calls integration of the self. This is the moment when the super empath stops operating from wounded empathy, stops saving others to ignore themselves, stops letting their intuitive nature be twisted by the urge to heal the narcissist. This is when the super empath steps into the state Jung described as individuation, the process of becoming fully, clearly, powerfully oneself, no longer ruled by external darkness. And when this happens, something irreversible takes place. The narcissist no longer has any power over them. Not because the empath is fighting back, but because they are no longer a compatible target for the narcissist's manipulation. There is no longer a hook, no entry point, no loophole, no psychic fracture for the narcissist to attach to. A narcissist can only control someone who is still governed by fear, who has not yet understood their own darkness, or who is still dependent on being seen. But when the super empath awakens, they are no longer dependent on anyone's gaze. This completely destroys the narcissist's operating system. Why? Because the narcissist can only exist within relational systems built on reflection. When the empath stops reflecting them, the narcissist falls into exactly what Kernberg described. Personality begins to disintegrate when the narcissist no longer has anyone to mirror their idealized self. And this is the final knot of the entire tragedy. The narcissist is not destroyed by the empath. They self-destruct because they no longer have the empath's light to uphold their makeshift personality structure. One of the greatest paradoxes of this system is this. The super empath is the only person the narcissist can never replace. Not because of some profound love, but because no one else has the capacity to activate such deep reflection. But what the narcissist never realizes is this. The super empath becomes untouchable at the very moment they stop trying to save the narcissist. And this is the fundamental psychological lesson this story wants to offer you. The power of a super empath does not lie in their ability to understand others, but in their ability to understand themselves. When a super empath awakens, they do not seek revenge. They do not try to prove anything. They do not need to win. They do not need to explain. They do not need to play the victim. They do not need to hold on to the memory of the pain. They only need to step into the energetic direction that truly belongs to them. And that is the absolute victory. Why? Because narcissists do not know how to live in the light. They can only exist in the chaos of an unripe consciousness. When the empath steps into the light, the narcissist cannot follow. Not because of who is right or wrong, but because these two psychological structures operate according to completely different principles. The empath expands through consciousness. The narcissist contracts through defense. When the empath expands, the narcissist is pushed outside the field of influence. This is not a strategy, it is a law. But the deepest point of this ending is not the narcissist's collapse, it is the rebirth of the super empath. When the empath steps out of the cycle of darkness, they enter a depth very few people in life ever reach. The depth of a consciousness that has seen the dark, endured it, understood it, and risen above it without losing its humanity. This is the kind of person Jung called the wounded healer, one who heals through pain that has been transformed, not through self-sacrifice. And at this level, the super empath is no longer a victim. They become the most conscious one, the one capable of bringing light into any relationship without losing themselves in the process. Most of the super empath's path is a path society does not teach, schools do not teach, books do not teach. It is the path of the soul, a journey only those who have loved the wrong person, who have given their heart to someone who could not hold it, who have been betrayed by the very person they wanted to heal, can truly understand. But it is precisely that journey that makes them into the strongest version of themselves. And here is the final, most important point. When the super empath awakens, they become something the narcissist never anticipated, a living witness of truth. Not the truth about the narcissist, but the truth about the empath themselves. The truth that they are not weak. The truth that they are not easy to exploit. The truth that their kindness is not a flaw. It is a strength. The truth that their empathy is not a weakness. It is the ability to read the psychological structure of human beings deeper than almost anyone else. And the truth that when they walk away, they walk straight into their own life without looking back, without regret, without seeking validation from anyone. This is what Jung called consciousness expansion, the widening of awareness. So in the end, this story is not about the narcissist. It never was. This is the story of the super empath, of the journey from darkness to light, from confusion to clarity, from woundedness to inner wholeness. The narcissist believes that betraying the empath is their victory. But that very betrayal is the final act that pushes the empath into a form of rebirth the narcissist will never reach. And that is the real reason why. Betraying a super empath is never the narcissist's victory. It is their full stop and the empath's beginning.